I want to welcome you, Alex, to our program tonight. We're so happy that our audience is here with us. If many of our audience members have been with us before, and if you have, you know that the Network for Responsible Public Policy connects people with thought leaders like Alex who educate and inspire. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome Professor Alexander Keyssar to discuss the challenges to democracy for November 2024 and beyond. Alex is the Matthew W. Stirling Jr. Professor of History and Social Policy at Harvard. A historian by training, he specialized in the exploration of historical problems that have contemporary policy implications. His book, The Right to Vote, The Contested History of Democracy in the United States, was initially published in 2000. It was named the best book in U.S. history by both the American Historical Association and the Historical Society. It was also a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Book Award. A revised and updated edition of The Right to Vote was published in 2009. If you'd like to learn more about Alex and our programs, please visit our website at nfrpp.org. You'll also find videos of all of our past programs. And while you're there, please sign up for future program notices and our monthly newsletter. Alex, thank you for joining NFRPP tonight. I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're going to take questions from the audience, and we'll address those at the end after you speak.
All right.
Or tell me how you'd like to do it.
Thank you. Thank you. And my plan is to speak for about a half hour. Does that and open it up to questions? So I think there should be plenty of time. I have a feeling this program will generate questions.
I bet it will.
And I'm happy to do that. So thanks to you for the generous introduction. Thanks for inviting me in the first place, and my apologies for the technical difficulties going on, but it's proof why it's always good to have a second computer in the house, since the first one was somehow not connecting to Zoom. I think I want to begin, and as I've been thinking about this talk and thinking also about not replicating too much about the Electoral College, since I did speak to you folks about the Electoral College a few years ago, but I'm open to talking about that at more length in the question period. I think I'm going to frame this talk a little more broadly about the challenges to American democracy. And if that seems too broad or whatever, we can narrow it down. But instead of focusing right at the beginning on micro questions like voter suppression and certifying the vote and then moving on, I think I want to give a broader frame, which might help explain my thinking and the thinking of a number of people that I'm in almost constant conversation with. I guess the starting point here is to say that from my perspective as a student of American democracy for a long time, I think we are in a political crisis. I think that I don't think we should sugarcoat that. I mean, part of my evidence for that is at least among many people I know have been talking about the knots in their stomach during this election season, which, I mean, there's always a little bit of drama in election seasons, but this one I think is generating more than its usual doses of anxiety. And I think that that's because we do feel rightly that our democracy is in peril, and that it has already been severely damaged in ways that we've partially registered, but maybe not fully. And let me just mention a couple of things related to this, and then continue this framing before looking ahead at some specifics of the election. The first is that the legitimacy of our elections themselves has been challenged. The outcome of the 2020 election was not only challenged at the time, it is still being challenged. And when the legitimacy of elections is challenged, the legitimacy is undermined. And if the outcomes are considered illegitimate among large swaths of the population, that poses a danger. And we know that that happened last time, and it could repeat this November. And part of the danger, of that, I mean, there are many ways to express what the danger of that might be, but one way to state it is, if you don't respect the outcome of elections, then what? What is the alternative to elections? Conventionally and historically, the alternative to elections is force. And that, I think we all agree, is far from desirable. A second concern is that the right to vote of numerous of our fellow citizens is under challenge once again. And those challenges will result in the deprivation of the right to vote from some people who won't get to vote at all, or in a different constellation, a different configuration of it, through partisan gerrymandering, which is extreme right now in this country. You're depriving people of the right to vote for candidates of their own choosing, in effect. And a third feature to mention here, but I will be alluding in different ways to others, is that our courts are abetting that. I think that one of the reasons that some people, including myself, have knots in their stomach is a lack of confidence that our courts can be counted on to remedy the situation, even in the way that they did in the 2020 election, when we all know that there were 65 or 66 court cases brought, and all but one of them were tossed. I mean, the Supreme Court has been undercutting voting rights for quite a considerable amount of time. And it has also made the remarkable ruling that there is nothing that the court system can do about partisan gerrymandering. It says that it's not okay to discriminate because of race, but to construct electoral districts based on party is fine. And the last thing I would mention, and again, this has become kind of commonplace in a certain way for us, but I think that we need to let it register maybe more deeply, which is that truth seems to have become optional in political life and beyond. Now, part of this crisis that we're facing stems from factors that can be found in other countries as well. I mean, I don't want to overdo the uniqueness of the United States. The increased strength of illiberal political forces that do not necessarily believe in civil liberties or in democracy. This can be found in a number of places, including in Europe. The disappearance of center-right parties, which is certainly what the Republican Party used to be, but that is happening in a number of different countries. And alongside it is the presence of, to use the term that the too many syllable term that political scientists use, of asymmetrical political polarization. That's to say, you're getting political polarization, but it's not really that both sides are moving out to the extreme, but that one side is, and that this polarization is very, very importantly affective. That's to say, it is not simply a matter of policy preferences. People on the different sides really are not liking each other. They're distrusting each other. And maybe one could use stronger verbs than that. But if some of these characteristics are widespread, the crisis, I think, in the US, and I'm trying to, suggest ways to understand where we are, that it's particularly critical here because of the age and the brittleness of our institutions. The fact is, we have a constitution, marvelous as it may be in some ways, that was designed in the 18th century and designed for the 18th century, for a world without political parties. And it's been modified only slightly since then. And the institutions that were erected in the late 18th century have built-in democracy deficits. They're not designed to be fully democratic. And they also, because of the nature of the changing world and because they made some mistakes in the institutional design, the constitutional architecture created room for manipulation of elections. And those have become increasingly salient. One consequence of that, and one feature of our current situation, is that we have what some of my colleagues up here have called minority rule, that there is something close to minority rule in this country. Certainly the Senate can be described in that way. It does not follow the principle of one person, one vote. And the Senate is right now and for the last number of years, has been quite evenly divided in terms of the number of seats. But Democratic senators represent 70% of the population. And Republican senators, who are 50% of the Senate, represent 30% of the population. And then too, there's partisan gerrymandering, which I have also mentioned. And there are increasingly detailed local, statewide efforts to enforce minority rule. I mean, there, and to keep the will of the people, the collective voices of the people, from matching the structure of representation. We see this in a number of states. For example, North Carolina, where I lived for many years, and North Carolina has been, in terms of its voters, has been a 50-50 state for a number of years, but its congressional delegation is, I think, 11-3 in favor of the Republicans. And what happens in states like that, and we see this in a number of places, is that you get heavily Republican congressional and legislative delegations, but Democrats tend to win statewide office. And then now there are efforts to even make that impossible. And Texas just passed a law this year saying that you can't win statewide office without winning a majority of counties. Well, it's a majority of, in other words, you can win a majority of the people, but if you don't win a majority of the counties, and there are many small rural counties in Texas that could block the election of a Democratic governor. And we also know that, for example, what happened in North Carolina, the last gubernatorial election, when the statewide election did elect a Democrat, and the legislature proceeded to take a number of powers away from the governor and give them to other officials. Another feature that I want to make, or another that I want to allude to, and I could go on all night about this, and I won't, has to do with the existence of state laws backed by the Supreme Court that impose a two-party system on the country and make it very, very difficult for third and fourth parties to get on the ballot. These laws were passed mostly in the 1890s and 1910s. The common name for them was anti-fusion laws. They remain on the books, and they make it very hard for any other parties to get on the ballot. Now, there are movements going on right now to get rid of the anti-fusion laws. But I think a factoid that I often trot out, and that I think is largely true. At least no one has given me a real exception, except you could make a potential exception for the country of Uruguay. But Uruguay aside, the United States is the only country in the world where no new political party ever came to power in the 20th century, or since 1900. It's now a century and a quarter. That's a remarkable fact. And it might be because, you can say, well, that's because our two parties are both so terrific. Or I think there are actually other reasons as well that have to do with the constriction of what's possible in our political system. So I see all of this as as a backdrop to what we're facing as we go into this election. And then let me talk now about in some more detail about voter suppression and provide some short-term and then longer-term historical context for understanding it. First, if you do a word gram, which is something that I learned or an assistant taught me how to do a while ago, of the phrase voter suppression or vote suppression, you find it's used very little in American history, except in two periods. One is the end of the 19th century when it's called vote suppression. If you see a graph of this, the graph suddenly shoots up. And the other time is the last 25 years. And it was really not an issue. And in the modern period, the recent period, this starts to become a big issue in the wake of the 2000 election. The 2000 election, we remember, was extremely, was that election that taught us that every vote really does count. Since I guess what was the number, 538 votes or something like that, 570 votes in Florida that decided the election. And in the wake of that election, the Republican Party took many steps to make it more difficult for poor people, African Americans, Latinos, to vote. One of these was voter ID laws, which are still on the books and still enforced and still are effective in some states. And then the battles in the states have been, variously been what counts as voter ID. I myself am in favor of having a voter. I have no objection to having a voter ID as a government-issued voter ID. But a system like the one in Texas, where a student ID does not count, but a gun-carrying permit does count, seems a little bit off base. And then the Supreme Court struck down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in 2011, removing protections for minority voters that had been in place since 1965. Within hours, literally hours, that's not metaphoric, within literally hours of that Supreme Court decision, a number of southern states changed their laws, making it more difficult to vote for various people. And I expect, since then, the Supreme Court has already trimmed away at other features of the Voting Rights Act. And I suspect that trend will continue. Now, in the current election, part of what we're seeing, the first round of what we're seeing, are attacks on the devices that were developed to encourage voting in 2020 during the pandemic. The use of drop boxes, for example, which turned out to be a great convenience for a lot of people, and now using the number of drop boxes in many places is being restricted. I forget what the state of Texas law is right now, but at least at one point they had declared that there could only be one drop box per county, including Harris County, which includes Houston and has 4 million people. One drop box for Harris County makes it difficult to use a drop box. There's been a revival of discussion of requiring proof of citizenship in some states. And we know that was actually within the last couple of weeks, that was an issue in Congress. It's illegal to vote if you're not a citizen, but they wanted to strengthen that. And the possibilities of early voting in a number of states have now been reduced. So, the list could go on. About the number of devices being, or the number of things that are happening at a very micro level, state by state, sometimes county by county. Now, the question is, and this is where I'm trying to, put my own expertise as a historian to some use here, is why is this happening? How can this happen? Well, the starting point of an answer is that there's no right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. It's just not there. I sometimes, probably tediously, ask students in my classes, okay, where is the right to vote in the Constitution? And they come forth with various guesses about where. Oh, it's in the Bill of Rights. Well, actually, go look at the Bill of Rights, or it's someplace else. They can't find it. There is no right to vote in the U.S. Constitution. They left voting rights issues to the states. Not because they thought that was not for any principled reason at all, but it had to do with the politics of ratification of the Constitution in the late 1780s, because different states had different requirements already to vote, and they were afraid that if they chose too strict or too lenient a standard, it might annoy some state and they wouldn't vote for ratification. So it had to do with the parochial, I mean, important, but parochial concerns of the framers in the 1780s. Over time, over long stretches of time, many states took steps to broaden the franchise. Others were less eager to do so, but it did happen. And the federal government did intervene beginning just after the Civil War, with a long series of amendments to the Constitution that made it unconstitutional to deprive people of the right to vote for particular reasons. This was the 15th Amendment did that. You could not deprive someone of the right to vote because of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 19th Amendment did this with respect to women. But what's notable about these constitutional amendments is that they do not affirmatively grant the right to anyone. The 19th Amendment does not say women have the right to vote. The 15th Amendment does not say Black people have the right to vote. It says you can't deny them the right to vote for a particular reason, which leaves a lot of room for discriminatory franchise regulations. I mean, this was very evident at the end of the 19th century when the 15th Amendment was on the books. You could not discriminate based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But in fact, 90% of the African Americans in the South were disfranchised. But ostensibly, it was not because of race. It was because they didn't pay taxes. They couldn't pass a literacy test or an understanding clause, or eventually they couldn't participate in the all-white primary in the Democratic Party. Now, in the 1960s, further efforts came to restore the voting rights of African Americans from a Congress, a U.S. Congress, that had a very remarkable coalition of Republicans and Northern Democrats who came together to try to remedy this situation, and they were buttressed by the Supreme Court, which not only declared the principle of one person, one vote, but invoked the quotes equal protection clause of the 14th Amendment as a way to, in detail, protect some of those rights. But in fact, that political coalition is gone. That political coalition of what you might call, moderate Republicans, and Northern liberal Democrats. I mean, they coming from many different places, but not in the South. That coalition is gone, and in recent decades, the courts have been trimming away at the applicability of the 14th Amendment to voting laws. Now, part of what I want to do again to kind of provide a historical context here is to allude back to my wordgram, which where it peaks in the late 19th century and again in the present. Because if you think of those two as periods of significant voter suppression, and it was, I mean, what went on in voter suppression was not in the South, in the late 19th century, was not just in the South where it was wholesale and massive, but it also, and I've argued this at length in a book, it also happened in the North, aimed at immigrant workers. There were all sorts of laws that were passed in many different states, including New Jersey and New York. In New York, I mean, New York had my favorite example of a law. It was not enforced for too long, but it was enforced for a while, where in response to the growth of a kind of left-leaning Jewish population in New York City, in New York, you had to register to vote every year. And in one year, they passed a law declaring that the only days on which you could register were the Jewish high holidays of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which was designed to keep the Jewish vote down, and it did. But there are a lot of examples, some of them less touching than that in a way. But you have this, but what happens in the late 19th and early 20th century, you ask why was voter suppression, happening then? And I think it was for a combination of two reasons. One was that this was a period of very large scale immigration. And the second is that this was a period that had witnessed some empowerment of African Americans in the South. African Americans in the immediate wake of the Civil War had been elected to office in many different places. They were even elected to federal office, and they had some political power. The reaction, the voter suppression that appeared was a reaction to that. I mean, one quip that I'm guilty of uttering about this is that voter suppression is what you do when you can't disenfranchise people. When you can't outright disenfranchise people and say this category of people can't vote, well, then you find ways to suppress their vote with various, often procedural mechanisms. Now, what's notable is that in our modern period, say from 1990 to the present, is also a period of very high rates of immigration and a period that follows in the wake of the acquisition of some political power by African Americans. And I think that those two phenomena happening again, precipitating another wave of voter suppression. I just want to put it this way: I don't think it's a coincidence that these major phenomena are present at the same time as you get voter suppression on a large scale. And we saw it also, in a more micro way, if you think about it, about the lawsuits that were filed by the Trump campaign in 2020, the lawsuits that were filed in the wake of the election. Almost all of them were aimed at cities that had, okay, we couldn't restart. Hold on a second. I have to tell my computer not to restart. It has a life of its own, but it just gave me an hour. But the lawsuits were all filed at irregularities allegedly happening in cities with large African American and immigrant populations, in states that were where the rest of the state was more predominantly white. Now, voter suppression doesn't produce enormous changes in the electoral tallies. And it's extremely hard to measure. I've argued with people for decades about this, that it's very hard to count something that does not happen, which is somebody not voting, and what the reasons are that they did not vote. But I think it's fair to say that it can produce a 2 to 3% drop in turnout in an election. And a 2 to 3% drop in turnout, if it's not evenly distributed, can change the outcome of the election. I mean, we know that was the case in Florida in 2000. But the other thing about voter suppression, which worries me, is that the very act of engaging in it is to violate democratic principles. Is to say that it's okay to violate democratic principles, that the norms are being put aside. And I think, and I don't know whether I'm romanticizing the period in the 20 years after World War II or not. I don't think I am, but it seems to me there was a democratic ethos that prevailed during that period that was very dominant, but that's no longer so. Now, that has to do with the casting of votes. With respect to counting and certification of votes, one of the things that we know, and if you tune into the news as addictively as I do, you know that the process in presidential elections of counting and certifying votes is very complicated. I mean, we go and we cast votes, and then our locality will report those totals to counties, and then they will be aggregated to the states. In some states the actual certification of the initial certification comes from a statewide election board. Elsewhere, it can come from a county election boards. And one of the things that has been happening at the local level is that states have been introducing new procedures about who certifies the vote at a county level, or who has to sign off on it before it gets passed upstairs, and about who certifies the vote at the state level. And so that has become an arena of partisan manipulation, or potential partisan manipulation. It was left open by the laws as they existed. It was not, but there was a presumption that this was not to be handled in a partisan fashion, and that presumption seems to have disappeared. And then eventually, if you think of and part of what, in some states now, there are county boards that are certified that they can hold up the reporting of the election results until they do an independent investigation, which was never part of the process before, and which could delay things or alter things. Meanwhile, and then as we read quite recently, Georgia, which seems to be taking the lead in a number of these areas, has just passed a law saying that all ballots have to be hand counted immediately. I mean, they can machine counted, but there has to be a hand count, which can very likely introduce more error and more problems. And then, of course, is the issue of, once the electoral votes are sent from the state, certified by the governor of the state, finally signed on by the governor of the state, to Congress, what happens? I mean, that was our explosive event in 2020. And at the time in 2020, the procedure was governed by a piece of legislation called the Electoral Count Act, passed in 1887 as a delayed response to the crisis of 1876. And that law was one of the most incomprehensible laws ever passed by Congress, and everybody knew it. And I actually have sometimes given paragraphs of that law to my students and asked them to explain what it meant, and nobody knows what it meant. But happily, a bipartisan coalition came together and did do a revision of the Electoral Count Act. It's called the Electoral Count Reform Act, that was passed 2022 or 2023. And that does help things at the level of Congress. Until then, an objection to a state's totals could be filed by, if you had one member of the House and one senator that objected, then the objection was registered. If an objection was registered, the meeting of the joint session of Congress dissolved. They go back to their separate chambers and vote and decide on that. And that could happen 25 times in the course of the procedure. Now it takes 1/5 of members of both chambers in order to do that. Now that's not, that's a significantly different threshold than one person, but it's also something which could still happen. And then there are also some other vague provisions in the revised law that were left open as a matter of compromise, and which could leave room for contestation, ambiguity, and legal action at the level of the congressional acceptance of electoral votes. So we're not out of those woods yet. So finally, let me just say a few words about the Electoral College, and then again, if people have more questions about it, the Electoral College. The Electoral College was a poorly designed institution from the outset, as I've commented in various places. It was really pretty unpopular within a few hours of its passage. It was amended the Constitution was amended early in the 19th century to deal with the fact that the original Constitution did not have people distinguish between their ballots between president and vice president, and that had to be changed. But it was producing crisis. The fact that the constitutional provision left it up to the state to decide how electoral votes would be allocated. States did not and do not have to have popular elections to choose their electors. State legislatures can do it by themselves. Now, all states now have passed state laws saying that they will hold popular elections, but it's not inconceivable that should there be some kind of deadlock or unclarity in those outcomes, that a state legislature could step in. It's unlikely at this point. The state legislature of Florida was prepared to do that in 2000 if the Supreme Court case had come out the other way. So we still have this problem lingering from the framers' design of leaving it up to the states. That also led to chaos during the first 30 or 40 years of the nation's history as states changed from one system to another. They had elections by district, which, according to James Madison, was what most of the framers had in mind. They thought electors would be chosen by district. They never thought winner-take-all would be instituted. But winner-take-all appeared as a result of gamesmanship by the political parties. And then eventually we ended up with everybody having winner-take-all, although that's not mandated by the Constitution. And so we have this archaic system which does not conform to the principle of one person, one vote, which deforms the processes of election. I mean, if you think about what civic life is like in the United States, in states, there is a highly focused, highly energetic, in fact, probably manically energetic set of electoral campaigns going on in the swing states, which account for 22% of the population. And the rest of us are largely rendered into spectators who may be able to write checks, but that's there is no civic engagement or civic culture in the political life in a presidential election in most of the country. And let me conclude with the following, another little factoid, which I take from a person who studies elections, who's sort of a math person, a numbers guy, and a good one. And I have no reason not to distrust this figure, but it's his figure and not mine. He says that if the margin of difference in the popular vote, in the national popular vote, is 3% or less, then there is a 1 in 3 chance that we will get a quotes wrong winner, that the winner of the popular vote will not become the president. And certainly, as we look at the polls leading up to the election right now, it's going to be within 3%, unless the polls are wildly off. And I want to conclude. I want to go back to large framing, if I may take another 2 or 3 minutes here, and get people upset. But what I'm thinking about, then I'm probably somewhat older than most of the people who are there. I can't see anybody's faces, so I can't judge this. But it was probably historically innocent, if not naive, of us to believe that American democracy would go on forever. I mean, it's a sobering thought, but I mean, I think that this was something that we all presumed. I presumed this, and I think most people, maybe not among the youngest folks out there now, but I think that, but yet, in fact, what we know. What I know as a historian, and what we know studying the past, is that in the long history of democratic life, most democracies haven't endured for more than a few decades, and almost none of it lasted for as much as a couple of centuries. I mean, Athens lasted 2 centuries, which is quite remarkable. It's more common for democracies to erode or be overturned than to endure. And even if we look at our own national history, I mean, we pride ourselves on 225 years of democracy, but there were periods when democratic values were not cherished, to say the least. And there's a long period in US history when an entire region of the country lacked even the semblance of democracy, disenfranchising and disempowering a large and exploited racial minority. So in a way, I guess I want to say that it's a little bit surprising. It says something, causes for reflection about ourselves, that we have believed in the permanence of US democracy. And I think we may face challenges in that arena very soon. But the final, more upbeat comment I want to make is that if indeed our democracy does falter, and even if it becomes unrecognizable, which I hope not, but I think it may well falter in the next decade, it does not necessarily mean that, or it doesn't mean at all that democratic institutions and values will disappear. I think we might end up imagining a world where democracies appear and fade, where they ebb and flow. The people who have historically been most in favor of democracy are those who live in authoritarian regimes. If you do polls, but those are the folks who say, yes, we want democracy. And then I would expect that even if we do falter, we will see a strong new movement for genuine democracy sometime not too far into the future. So with that mixture of upbeat and downbeat notes, let me draw my comments to a close and open this up.
So we've got some good questions, but I want to start with one upbeat note, which is that appears that we have a number of students who are participating tonight as part of an assignment. So we can hope that that's a good sign for the future.
Yeah, good.
So
I hate to be part of someone's homework, but okay.
I think it's a compliment. Okay, so we're going to start up at the top here. Properly noted that NFRPP likes to give advice on policy issues to its audience on how to help solve or address issues. Beyond voting, are there any steps the normal citizen can take to strengthen elections and voting rights?
Yes. I think there are. I think that there are ways. I mean, I think engaging in a campaign, volunteering to work at the polls can do that. And that's certainly been an issue in recent years where lots of people are getting scared away from being poll workers because they don't want to get caught in some conflictual arena. I think it's also important to say that, right now we are understandably focused on national elections and the presidency, but state legislative races are awfully important, and they're very important to how presidential elections are conducted. So I think getting involved by voting and participating in electoral life of all sorts, and then I would I'd say read widely and talk to your friends.
Yeah, that's probably accurate. I think maybe organizations like the League of Women Voters does a very good job of promoting election, working and getting involved in politics at a local level or issues at a local level as well.
Exactly. No, exactly. And there are other organizations out there that one can. Common Cause is one. Demos is one. And you can find a place where I think you feel comfortable.
Exactly. Okay, I'll move on to our next question. How likely will the Constitution be updated to address the challenges that you've described?
Mhm.
It's interesting. We had an NFRPP program on this a few months ago, talking about the Constitution, and an issue that you raised early in the conversation tonight is that it was a document that was written so long ago, probably not envisioning the world that we live in now.
Right, right. I'm not. I'm not I'm not wildly optimistic about the possibilities of constitutional change. I mean, I spend a certain proportion of my time working hard to try to produce a constitutional amendment to get rid of the Electoral College, for example. Um, and I think that there are other constitutional changes that should also happen. I don't think that they will happen without some kind of crisis of some sort. But I think that, I mean, if there is a kind of crisis in this election, and let me be clear about my own view here, which is that the scenario that I fear most is a scenario in which it appears that Kamala Harris has won the election, but that outcome is not accepted by large numbers of people. I think that and then it ends up in a mess in the courts and in the streets. I mean, I don't think that's out of the question. Um, if there is some sort of crisis, I think that constitutional change may happen. I think that it's likely also to happen only if the configuration of political parties changes and we get more parties or somewhat different parties. I think that one of the defects, this is something which has occurred to me only late in life, is that one of the defects of a strict two-party system is that it becomes apparently, not necessarily accurately, but apparently very easy for each party to calculate whether any particular change benefits them or not. Um, and then if it benefits the other guys, it must be bad for us, etc. If that sort of two-party structure weakens, I think there may be greater chance for constitutional change.
Okay, so this actually sets up our next question really well. Recent news reports are saying that Liz Cheney and other disaffected Republicans may try to start a new party to counter Trump's hijacking of their party. You said we haven't had a new party in more than a century. Given how bad things are right now, do you think a new party is a possibility? And if so, could such a party be effective?
Um, we haven't had a new party come to power, is what I said. We have had attempts at new parties, but actually our system is set up to discourage new parties, and to make it difficult. That's part of what I was talking about, those laws. I also saw that Liz Cheney had said that, and she had actually hinted at it about 3 or 4 months ago as well. And I think that Liz Cheney and many other Republicans who are sympathetic with her or have become anti-Trump Republicans, I think that they are all thinking about what do we do? And I think that creating a new party would seem to be a very plausible strategy and almost an inevitable strategy. So, and I do think it's possible. I do think that there is a political space out there for a center-right party that is not the current Republican Party, and that would probably also draw some people who are now Democrats, but might feel more comfortable in a conservative but not MAGA party.
So in countries where there are more than two parties, do you end up with a diluted government?
I mean, sometimes, I mean, you can end up with, I mean, the danger is you can end up with unworkable coalitions or fragile coalitions.
Right.
I mean, sometimes you can get good coalitions that that are effective, but there are dangers to that as well. But um, at the moment, I'm kind of more ready to risk those dangers than the dangers of what we have. I mean, we see all sorts of examples of it where, I mean, you see, I mean, in France now, where there's this bizarre the left won the most votes in the election, but there's now a center-right government. And then if you get diluted in a small party, or take the case of Israel, where people are hostage to small parties, there are risks there. There's no ideal setup.
Okay, moving to the Electoral College. Can you speak to the Electoral College? Why was it necessary to begin with, and why is it now giving the minority power so much power?
I would say the Electoral College was not necessary to begin with. I mean, I highly recommend my book on this subject, but look, the framers of the Constitution had a lot of trouble deciding how a president should be chosen. They went around and around on it the whole summer of 1787. It was one of the issues they kept bringing up, and then they couldn't reach a conclusion. And the way we finally ended up with the Electoral College, I mean, the mechanism, and I imagine, the students who are out there, as well as others may recognize this. They got to the end of August, and they had like 90% of the Constitution written, but there were a few sticking points, the most important of which was this question of how to choose the president. So what did the Constitutional Convention do? It went on vacation for a week. This was Philadelphia in the late August, right? They'd been there all summer. They wanted to get out of it. George Washington went fishing. They went on vacation and left a committee in charge. It's called the Committee on Unfinished Parts, right? I mean, it's just, and it was the Committee on Unfinished Parts that came up with that. And the Electoral College was a compromise. There were some people who wanted a national popular vote, but the South would not accept that, and many others thought it was unwieldy. The Electoral College had the advantage of importing into the presidential politics, and I can explain this more if one wishes, the compromises over representation and slavery that had also been worked out with respect to Congress. But they knew it was kind of an experiment. They were uneasy about it, but they all knew that George Washington was going to be the first president anyway. So they said, well, let's go with it. So there was no kind of need for it in that sense. And it didn't work very well even at the beginning. I mean, there was an electoral crisis in 1800. And there was a second part of the question, which was,
why was it necessary to begin with? And the second part is, why is it now giving the minority power so much power?
It has always been capable of giving minorities, I mean, and the small states in particular, a certain amount of disproportionate power. I mean, that's the whole thing. Electoral votes are not the number of electoral votes each state gets are roughly, but not entirely, proportional to the population, because every state gets 2 electoral votes for its 2 senators, and that's true whether it's Vermont or California. And I think that what has happened more recently is that the number of smallish states in population, small rural states, that have become very conservative, the proportion of those states, has changed. It's not across the board. I mean, again, to mention Vermont, Vermont's a rural state with a socialist senator, but states like Montana and the Dakotas actually used to be very progressive, not so long ago, or West Virginia. So I think that there's been demographic shifts with political shifts that tend to emphasize this disproportion.
One more Electoral College question here. What electoral or institutional reforms do you think are most crucial for strengthening democracy in the face of current challenges?
That's an easy one. And that's not just about the Electoral College. Presumably it's about, I mean, I think we should get rid of the Electoral College. I think we should have a national popular vote, or as a compromise, I'd be happy to have a system where electoral votes in each state were were proportional. In other words, if you win 45% of the vote in New Jersey, you get 45% of the electoral votes. And I think that would go a long way towards changing the system and changing the nature of our elections. Beyond that, I think that we have to open up the electoral arena to more parties and get rid of the laws that discriminate against political parties. And I think we have to have very, very serious campaign finance reform. I mean, the amount of money that we spend in elections and electioneering, and we know there's study after study going on for years that policy outcomes are influenced by the inputs of campaign contributions by people. And so I would start with those three.
Okay, so here's a question about the Supreme Court. In what way has the Supreme Court been undermining voting laws?
Well, I guess the starting point with that, I would say, would be the Supreme Court's decision to get rid of sections 4 and 5 of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act, just to let me back up and do a little historical riff on the Voting Rights Act. Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. It has an important subtitle, which nobody ever notices. Everybody talks about the Voting Rights Act. There's a subtitle to the Voting Rights Act. The subtitle is An Act to Enforce the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, which had been passed a century earlier. Okay, so it's an enforcement act. Part of what was critical about it was that about the structure of it, the unusual structure of it, was that it had something called the preclearance provision. The preclearance provision was a provision that said that states with any history of discrimination in voting, and we could discuss that, but any history of discrimination in voting had to get in order to make any changes in their electoral system, or to even in doing districting each time, had to get the approval of either a federal court in Washington, the district court in Washington, or the Civil Rights Division, the Voting Rights Division of the Justice Department. It was a way of saying, it was creating this mechanism, that's what was called preclearance, that meant that a state or a county couldn't start discriminating, and then you'd have to wait until after the election to file suit afterwards, and then it would be too late, and maybe it would work for the next election, etc. So it was very, very, effective as a mechanism requiring preclearance. The Supreme Court threw that out, and it threw that out on the grounds that the designation of the states and counties, the covered jurisdictions, was based on data from the 1960s and not more recent data, which was a reasonable but in some sense unworldly point of view. This was in her dissent in the case, Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously wrote that it was like saying that you had to take your umbrella down because you weren't getting wet in a rainstorm. And so I think the Supreme Court did that. And there's also there have been recent cases where it has made it harder for jurisdictions to bring lawsuits alleging discrimination under Section 2, an earlier section of the Voting Rights Act, which is permanent. And it is now considering a case in which I'm marginally involved, that would also say that only states and not individuals can bring lawsuits regarding voting rights. So those are the main ways in which the Supreme Court has intervened to permit. It's supposed to permit discriminatory practices and to make it harder for legal action against discrimination to be mounted successfully.
Okay. This is a serious election, very serious election at all levels, where the future of democracy is at stake. In the short time to November, what should the priority candidate messaging be? Let's try and reparse that a little bit. What should the candidates' priorities be in their messaging leading at this stage of the game, leading up to Election Day?
It's a good question, but it's not my expertise, since I'm not. I don't claim to be, a campaign manager. I mean, I think that I think that the messages in the final day. I mean, I'd like to say something grand, and idealistic say, well, they should talk about democracy, but that has already become a contorted issue as about who's the threat to democracy. I mean, that's another example of the distortion of our politics, that both sides are saying the other. I think that the messaging you do in the final weeks are you want to emphasize your strength, and then you want to address your weaknesses. I mean, I think that it's easier for me to imagine advising Kamala Harris on this than former President Trump. But I think that she needs to talk more about the dynamics of the economy and economic policies, not just what she would do, but help to explain to the American people why inflation has been so high, and what it was that government could or could not do about that. And I think that she also has to talk more concretely about what to do with issues around the border. Those seem to be her. I expect that she will also emphasize, and I think this is probably inevitable, the issue of women's rights and abortion, because that's an issue that she's strong on.
So given all the ways of undermining the election, what tools does the current administration and or good government advocates have to fight back?
A very good question. And part of these electoral campaigns have become kind of programs for creating jobs for lawyers. The administration and a number of other organizations, I mean, they are fighting lawsuits right now. I mean, I think it's the case that, for example, the Republican Party has filed something like another 60 lawsuits to change electoral procedures in different locales, and fighting back against that. The Justice Department and the Voting Rights Division and the Civil Rights Division also has a role to play in resisting that. But I think that a lot will depend on engaging in local actions, and giving citizen support to election officials. And that will inescapably vary by town and county by county. But I think, I mean, if there's a sense of alarm lurking behind that question, the fact is there are teams and teams and teams of lawyers who are working to protect voting rights right now.
Okay. Let's see. Hope you can stay with us for a few more because we've got some good questions tonight. Um, uh, if a majority of candidates who get elected do not respect the idea of democracy, what do you see unfolding?
Um, I see two things unfolding primarily. One is that I see if there is such a majority, I would expect to see changes in electoral rules and procedures that they institute to make it harder and harder for them to lose an election. That's what you see in other countries when this happens, right? You get into office, you don't really believe in democracy, so I'm trying to think of the right non-vulgar term, but um you alter the election system, so so that so that you will win. And the second thing I think that you will see is the use of the law and the Justice Department, um, as a weapon against people who disagreed with you. Okay, let me go back to the first part of that question because it's interesting and it connects to what I was talking about the Voting Rights Act and the pre-clearance provision. And let me give an example of a change in system, and combating it. Uh, After the Voting Rights Act was passed, and people were enfranchised, Black people were enfranchised, in the South. A number of communities, there were a number of communities, cities, small cities in particular, was where this happened, where the population was 60%, 70% white, and the rest minority. And whites would control the city council, would control the entire city council because Black people couldn't vote. The Voting Rights Act is passed. Black people could vote. And the city council, until that time, had been elected by districts. So then what they could choose to do to change the system was that instead of having the council elected by district, and this really happened, these are real historical examples, they moved to having the city council members elected at large so that the entire population of the city would vote for everybody. So if you had a city that was 60 to 70% white, they would elect an all-white city council, which they would not have been able to do had there been a district system. Okay, and you will see that kind of thing. What the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act did was to prevent that, because if you made that change, you had to get it pre-cleared, and in fact, the Justice Department would not let you do something like that. But I expect that we will see a number of things like that, as we have seen in other countries, where efforts are made to just change the system to make it hard for your opponents to win.
Okay, I'm going to sort of put these two questions together, because they're somewhat similar. How can we better engage younger voters in the democratic process to ensure their voices are heard? And what advice do you have for beginner voters? And a beginner voter might not be necessarily a young person, but someone who's voting for the first time.
It's read the first part of the question again.
How do we better engage younger voters in the democratic process to ensure their voices are heard?
I think I'm left with cliches, about that. I think that we have to make clear that that it matters, that it can affect their lives, and that things won't go on smoothly forever, if they're not engaged. I don't know exactly how to do that. I mean, Taylor Swift may know how to do that much better than I do, and she may already have done it. I think that the parties should be doing more outreach, and I think that to younger voters, I mean, one of the sad truths has been that younger voters tend not to turn out. I mean, every year there's this thing, oh, the younger are going to turn out in larger number, and there's been some improvement, but still a majority, it'll be extremely surprising if the turnout of people under 30 is above 40% this year. But I think I used to not worry about that so much on the grounds that younger voters tend to become older voters. But I think that mobilizing them into political groups, focusing on the issues that really matter to the young. I mean, you know, a pessimistic example or a negative example I can give is that, one way you could do it would be to reinstitute the military draft. That tended to spark a lot of interest in voting, but I'm not sure that's really a good solution to this problem.
Yeah, probably not. Okay. Is economic inequality a factor in our current divisiveness and ability for our government to function?
Yes. I mean, the emphatic answer is yes. It's also, and I should note this, when we talk about turnout in elections, one of the things that's going to happen even in this election, however important it is that it'll be very surprising if turnout reaches as high as 60%. It won't go any higher than that. What that means is that more people will not vote than will vote for either candidate. That's a disturbing fact when you think about it. What's even more disturbing is that turnout correlates with education and income, so that the poorer you are, the less educated you are, the less likely you are to vote. And I think that has historically been because less advantaged members of the society have concluded that it really doesn't matter much to them that they're not going to get great treatment regardless. Now, some things can change that for some groups. I think that Obamacare may have changed that for some people, but I think that oh, hold on, I have to tell my computer to wait another hour.
Tell your computer we got two more questions.
No, it just gave me the option of another hour. I don't know why it's doing that. It's I think that I think that economic inequality and exploitation is always present in our political divisions. I think it has what has changed in the current way is that the poor and working people who work with their hands particularly, but have historically have been Democrats. The unions were Democratic. The unions felt abandoned. I think that we now have political parties that are largely led and represented by two different slices of the socioeconomic elites. I mean, where the Republican Party was, and I'm not sure it still is, but it still is strongly connected to the business and economic elites. And the Democratic Party is now more the party of the professional and educated elites. But that's leaving out a whole lot of people who are not part of either elite. And I think that there are the resentments that are out there. I think that the presence of real economic difficulties and socioeconomic problems is part of what's exacerbating, for example, the issue of immigration and that kind of divisiveness. That people are aiming their anger at Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, rather than at the people who may be more responsible. And that's a common dynamic historically, which doesn't make it any easier to solve.
Let's see here. You answered this earlier, but I think this is a good question to close on because it is powerful. What would you say to those who do not vote because they believe their vote does not matter? You referred to the 2000 election when it came down to a handful of votes.
Yeah, I guess I would say a couple of things to that. One is that it might matter, and you just don't know. And it's not a big investment of your time, and it just might matter. But I think there's a second reason as well, which is that I think that it's kind of emotionally and psychologically important for us to engage, to be part of it, to go to the polling place and see who else is there, and talk to people on the way in and mumble to people on the way out. I think that the actual physical process of engagement is a small source of strength, and one that you can take with you and build on. That's all. So for me, that's also a reason why I prefer in-person voting to voting by mail. I mean, I think that the act of engagement in an institution gives you more of a sense of belonging in the society, and over time, more of a sense of actual empowerment.
Great answer.
Thank you.
Alex, thank you for sharing your valuable perspective with the Network for Responsible Public Policy's audience. You know, you're always welcome back. Tonight's program, oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
All right,
No, I
tonight,
was going to say I'd love to come back, and you've been an excellent host, and the questions have been very good. So this has been good. A little tiring, but good.
we have a great audience. And tonight's program really, I think, demonstrates our special niche of providing reliable, neutral information and from respected experts, a key ingredient for a viable democracy. It leads to sensible discussions and policy compromises and moves the needle forward. Please watch your email for a brief survey on tonight's program. Your input helps shape future programs. Thank you. Alex, good night, and I hope we see you again soon.
Well, I look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.